What would it take to arouse your life, to experience more connection, more pleasure, more realness, in and outside of the bedroom? I'm August McLaughlin, and this is Girl Boner Radio.
In that moment, I had this massive wave of energy and pleasure that just came up through the bottom of my feet, up my whole body, and literally shot out my heart. It was just this biggest burst of love. And all these tears start running down my face. I can't even move. It was just this unbelievable experience I had never experienced before.
Years ago, Susan Morgan Taylor was in a sexless marriage, and she longed for something more. Several major epiphanies and a phone call like no other changed everything. As a kid, Susan learned that everything sex-related was shameful, including touching her own body.
I remember when I was a little kid, I started masturbating very, very young. I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I used to sleep on the floor in my parents' room, next to their bed on the floor. I'd pull my little blanket in there, and I remember having a moment where I was exploring my body, and my mom kind of looked down at me and just sort of gave me this look of what are you doing? And so I really got the message that my body was shameful, and that thing I was doing that just felt so good, maybe there was something that I should hide about it. When I was a teenager, when my parents found out that I was having sex, I really got reprimanded. My mother told me I was ruining my life because I had had sex with my boyfriend. So I can't say that I really had a lot of positive influences around sex and sexuality.
Still, Susan's sexuality found a way. At first, anyway.
I'm a very sexual human being, and I was even as a child and as a teenager. And so the shame certainly didn't stop me from exploring, but it definitely made it feel like I certainly didn't have anyone to turn to for an education on that, or if I had concerns about something, I didn't feel that I had anyone I could go to as a teenager. I think what that turned into is maybe just kind of assuming that I should know where to go to kind of learn about that, assuming that I just should know what to do. And because there was that shame there, I didn't know how to really learn about sex in any kind of a productive way. So I just sort of defaulted to doing what we do.
Yeah, learning through experience and exploring and kind of teaching yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Which, that led to a lack of enjoyment of sex, I think, for quite a number of years.
Including during her 10-year marriage, which became basically sexless.
I was the one who was really just not interested in sex. I had lost interest. We had 2 little kids. We'd been together a long time, and there were a lot of other things going on in that relationship as well that just didn't make it safe for me emotionally. So what happened over time was I just completely disconnected from my own pleasure and my own turn on. Any kind of desire to be intimate with my husband was just pretty much out the window. And when I wasn't able to feel the things I wanted to feel, I just kind of blamed him. What I ended up doing was just kind of giving into it to keep him happy. Or I would use sex as kind of a bargaining chip. Like, oh, well, I kind of want this thing from him, so I'll just, I'll give him a little cookie and, maybe I'll get my way. And so there really was very little depth and connection.
Susan longed for both of those things, and then some.
I'm a very spiritual person, always have been, and I always had this longing just to feel I just wanted to feel something deeper. I wanted sex to feel like something more than just sex, or more than just a quickie where you just stick it in and it's over in a few minutes. I had no problems with orgasm. I was able to orgasm very easily and very frequently. It just wasn't enough for me. There was really something missing, and I just had this longing for something more. So even though I was really shut down and wasn't interested in sex, I wanted the connection. I wanted to experience pleasure. I just didn't know how to create that with him.
Once Susan left that marriage, her libido skyrocketed.
My sex drive just blossomed and came back online. I just suddenly felt alive. I felt interested. I was getting attention from men in a way that I had never felt before.
2 years later, after giving herself time to mourn her marriage and get to know herself, she said, she ended up in another relationship with a man who happened to be an expert in sexuality.
He had studied and trained and learned about all different kinds of things. And I thought, wow, like here's a man who's really going to be able to rock my world. Like finally.
He thought so too.
He tells me, well, I'm just going to, I'm going to make your body feel all kinds of things you've never experienced before. And do you want to feel a full body orgasm? I can give you that.
A full body orgasm, Susan thought. Yes, please.
I'm thinking like, wow, this is going to be really great. I'm going to really get to have this experience that I've just been longing for. And this person's going to like deliver it to me.
That didn't exactly happen.
The sex was pretty disappointing. Just did not take me to that place I wanted to go to. I didn't even really reach climax when we had sex the couple of times that we tried. What it did for me was it made me suddenly realize is, wow, I have always made the man responsible for my pleasure.
Something that is not uncommon in straight relationships, where helpful sex ed was lacking.
I had this aha moment of realizing, wow, if this guy says he could do all these things and like make my body feel like a full body orgasm, well, it's my body. Like, surely I can find that pathway within my own body myself. It's not something that I have to depend on a man to bring to me. Like, I could educate myself. I could learn my own body, learn my own sexual energy. I could do this because I really didn't want this problem to follow me into the future. I didn't want more disappointing sexual experiences. I didn't want to keep making my partners responsible for my own enjoyment. So I just was like, I'm going to take this into my own hands, literally. And I made this declaration to undergo the study of my own sexuality.
Shortly after making this declaration to herself and the universe, Susan said, some wild things happened. First,
a book jumped off the shelf of me while I was up at my yoga class, and it was a book about orgasm, tantric orgasm for women.
A game-changing read, she said. It gave her a whole new perspective.
Where I would set aside a couple of hours and I would start to just work with my own body. Things like slowing down, not focusing on climax as the goal of my self-pleasure experiences, but rather learning how to cultivate awareness and sensitivity in my body and in my genitals.
A few weeks into these weekly dates where she would explore her body without orgasm as the goal, something astonishing happened.
I have never told this story publicly, August, so I feel like this is the place. This is the place to tell this because this is really a huge part of what happened for me.
This experience involved books too, sort of.
I've been in Austin, Texas at the time, and I was at a local bookstore. It's like a Monday afternoon. Just picked my young daughter up from school, and my phone rings, and the number coming through is it's a private number. I never answer calls from private numbers, but everything in me was like, answer this call, like take this phone call, take this phone call. So just on a whim, I answer the phone. And it's this man's voice on the other line. And he starts to explain that he's conducting research on brainwaves and altered states of awareness, and that he had been given my contact information by, at the time, a very well-known author and researcher sort of in the field of science and consciousness.
Susan has no idea why her information was passed along. The whole thing felt a little like a scheme, she said. Like he only mentioned this famous author's name to get her to say yes.
Part of me is like, God, I don't know if I really believe it, but it was so intriguing to me. So I said, hey, look, I'm out right now. I really can't take this call, but I'm really interested in talking more with you. So can you call me back tomorrow at such and such a time? I'll be available. So he's like, no problem. So he calls me back the next day. It turns out he's a sex therapist.
So he said at least?
Sort of led me through these series of questions, which I knew what he was doing. It was sort of this psychological thing where you get the person to kind of answer yes to a lot of like very small questions, and it builds trust and also actually takes you into sort of an altered state. So I knew kind of what was going on. I felt extremely safe. It was a phone call. This man didn't know where I lived.
What did she have to lose? Plus,
it was at this place in my life where I was like so curious, so ready to learn something new. And so I went with it.
He got her consent to guide her to start touching herself.
I was like, okay, this is totally weird and I'm so into it. Like, let's try it. So I was willing to touch myself.
At one point in their conversation, the man said he sensed that Susan was having some kind of trauma response. What followed wasn't a deep dive into whatever trauma that was, no big talk about it. Instead, it was more touching. Here's how that whole thing played out. He said,
Are you willing to, to touch your clitoris, to touch your genitals? I'm like, let's go. Like, this is great. Like I'm on this sexual exploration journey. So he leads me into this practice of touching myself. There was some genital stimulation where I was massaging, I was touching my clitoris. He starts to guide me through a lot of healing. He recognizes that I have this place where I hit this point where I met some old trauma that I was holding. And I'm not referring necessarily to like sexual abuse or rape, but I had some patterning in my sexual nervous system and in my subconscious. And he identified it, and he takes me through this process where it literally moves me right through that. When he said that, that there's a trauma response happening, I knew what it was. Like the fear of abandonment was a big one for me. And so being emotionally vulnerable and open was really scary for me. And I had just gotten out of this relationship too with this man where there was a lot of love there. I really fell in love with this man, the one that promised me all these crazy sexual things. Like I had really, for the first time in my life, really let my heart go. And then it just kind of all came crashing down. So I was very sensitive at this point. And so he starts to do what I recognized as subconscious reprogramming. He had me just imagine that he could play the role of any male figure, like whoever I wanted him to be. And so I was visualizing him in front of me, touching myself and coming into a state of arousal. And he was saying things to me like, "You're safe. I'm never going to leave. I'm with you." I'm in this state of arousal. I'm touching myself. Suddenly, I realize I'm in just this very high state of arousal, and I'm in this orgasmic state, and I'm perfectly safe. I'm completely by myself, like in my bedroom, doing this to myself. I had this experience of just this pleasure in my body and my hands tingling and vibrating almost. And I just was like, what is this?
she said it was incredible.
Because to have this experience of just this solid presence, and yet I'm also accessing this extremely vulnerable part of myself through my sexual energy and my arousal, and then going into a state of orgasm, like an orgasmic state while I'm on the phone and while he's kind of reprogramming my subconscious while I'm in this altered state using the sexual energy. And it was so safe and so beautiful and so healing that I just remember saying to him, like, "You really helped me." And in my head, I'm like, who is this person? Where did you study? Like, how do you do what you do?
At the time, Susan was in graduate school. She was getting her degree in professional counseling.
And when I got off the phone with this man, I'm like, I want to do sex therapy. Like, this is like unlike anything I've ever experienced.
It's also very different from conventional sex therapy, by the way, which doesn't involve any self-pleasuring during sessions. Nothing actually sexual happens during sex therapy. It's talk therapy that's focused on sexuality and intimacy. But the healing that can come from processing trauma and learning to better connect with your sexuality in healing ways, those are definitely standard parts. And Susan loved that.
So we get off that call and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to follow up with you in a couple days." So he calls again in a couple days and we do another session just like that. And I just said, "You just changed my life." And I never heard from this person ever again.
She never even learned his full name. When she tried looking him up later, no one by that name he gave seemed to exist. Now she thinks he was truly a therapist and needed to protect his professional identity while he was doing this kind of edgy research. But that barely seemed to matter to Susan. What did matter was reaching a sex goal soon after.
2 weeks after that experience, I had a moment by myself during one of my pleasure dates where I just was implementing this relaxation, being in my body, and I go into a state just like I had on the phone with this man. My hands start vibrating, my face is tingling, and all of a sudden I have this wave of pleasure that just shoots up from the bottom of my feet, waves through my whole body, and bursts out my heart just in this massive feeling of love. And I had this realization at that moment of, oh my God, This is orgasm. This is full body orgasm. This is something that exists within me. And this love that's pouring out of my heart, this is who I am. This love exists within me. And this massive pleasure I'm feeling in my body right now is like my natural state when some of these obstacles are just cleared out of the way.
All the work Susan had been doing to explore her sexuality, including the guided phone sessions, had paid off.
I had cleared out some of the things that had been in the way of my ability to recognize myself as love, as orgasm, and that pleasure exists within me. It's not something that somebody brings to me. And up until that point, I'd made my partner respond like, he's going to give me an orgasm, or this man's going to rock my world. He's going to bring me pleasure. Or I was looking for love out there, like trying to grab on to relationship in order to find love. And I have this realization of, oh my God, like these things exist within me. Nobody gives this to me. And I just found the pathway within myself.
Have you been feeling like a getaway, a little escape from the stresses of daily life or the news? Prioritizing pleasure and connection is vital these days, and the Pleasure Chest has a getaway collection that can help you do so, whether you set aside an hour at home or part of a day, or you actually get away for a weekend. Explore their top picks like the Skins Rose, Buddies Rose, Purrs Clitoral Pulsing Vibrator, the Jimmy Jane Hello Touch Finger Vibrator, which comes with a remote control, and the Honey Playbox, which is this sucking toy that looks like a creamsicle. Find it all and start shopping at thepleasurechest.com. Shipping is always discreet and free in the U.S. with orders over $75. Again, that's The Pleasure Chest at thepleasurechest.com. Susan said that finding the kind of pleasure and connection that she had longed for within herself and those full body orgasms had everything to do with letting go.
The approach that I really had discovered was about letting go of the goal. So to quit looking for orgasm, quit looking for something to happen, and instead embrace what's actually present right here and right now.
Super different from what she had done before.
When I would have these pleasure dates with myself, for example, and I would start to touch myself intimately, first of all, I didn't have a lot of sensation. I mean, I could have orgasms, no problem, like through self-pleasure or through sex. But when I really slowed down, I really got present with myself, there wasn't a lot going on. It was kind of numb.
Now she was approaching that numbness differently, which was not easy at first.
So part of me, it's like something's wrong and I need to feel more. And then remembering like, okay, I'm trying something new. I'm getting curious. I'm going to just relax. I'm going to just sit here with this feeling of numbness that's in my body right now. And very quickly that numbness changed into just really frustration. And then it changed into anger. And then it changed into just deep sorrow and grief to where I was literally just like sobbing and crying and just this old grief that I had somehow been storing in that part of my body. It began to move upward from my genitals and kind of out my heart. Really that part of my body where it wasn't safe to feel those feelings for whatever reason at the time that they were actually present. And so instead I stuffed them down and they were just like being stored as numbness in my genitals. It all came out, these moments of just massive emotional release. And I sunk into it. I leaned towards it. I said yes to that. And even like, okay, give me more, like bring me more of this. I just say yes to whatever the heck this is.
What happened next floored her.
I started to have a lot more sensitivity in my genitals. Really stopped relying on mental fantasy as well. I made this massive shift to going kind of from being in my head and relying on the mind to really being present with just what is in my body, the physical sensations that were in my body. And it gave me a completely different experience, an orgasmic experience that came and arose from a state of relaxation and non-goal orientation rather than how I had traditionally experienced orgasm, which was through tightening up my body and using fantasy and reaching climax, and then it kind of is over. What had happened now was I was just present, and orgasm was more of this thing that just was like a wave that would just rise up from the moment very organically without me having to try for it or make something happen.
Just like during those phone calls, Susan was touching herself, but she stayed with her body and let go of her mind. And yes, the pleasure and orgasms that happened were great. But a lot of what she was doing, she said, wasn't pleasant.
Like, didn't hurt, but it was kind of uncomfortable. It's like suddenly like there's a lot of these uncomfortable emotions that are coming up. So I was touching myself sexually and having these experiences where I wasn't relying on my mind. I wasn't using fantasy or mental images at all, because that was really my default. Like, I would use fantasy and then I'd orgasm and it would be great. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I was really missing out on a whole other part of the spectrum of my pleasure that I didn't even know was a possibility by just kind of setting the mental piece aside and letting myself come into my body and just feeling what was happening in my body in the here and now. That's really the thing that opened up the gateway to these different types of orgasm.
It also shed light on her past sex challenges.
I realized why I had been so disinterested in sex in my marriage. I was completely emotionally shut down. I had a lot of emotional content that was being stored in my body that I didn't even know was there. And I was also like tensing up and trying to make orgasms happen, which I didn't have a problem doing, but there was just an emptiness in it.
That realization set her on the path to one of her career focuses today, helping women in particular feel more connected and free in their sexuality. Research shows that women, people with a vulva, and queer folks learn a lot less about their body and capacity for pleasure than cisgender men. Working with women and couples is Susan's sweet spot.
I just knew that I had found something really incredible, and that if more women could learn this pathway and find this pathway that I had just discovered in myself, that the world would literally be a different place.
Susan turned this all into her life's work. Today, she's a somatic sex therapist, providing a kind of therapy that explores sexuality through a mind-body lens.
It really made me see that love is what we are, and pleasure is inherent within us, and orgasm is what is literally accessible to us just when we're able to kind of get the debris out of the way, that we don't have to go out there and like grasp for it.
She has also continued to apply all she's learned to her intimate life. In fact, about 8 months after her guided self-pleasure phone calls and the full-body orgasm that followed, she met someone very special.
A lovely man who was really interested in just growing and learning, and I was able to really bring in a lot of the things that I had discovered and learned, and some of these different approaches to sex that are not really mainstream. He was really open to just trying it. I learned what I liked, what I didn't like. I was no longer really afraid to speak up for myself and use my voice. And he was a very safe relationship.
Together, they shared another incredible orgasmic experience. One night, they went out to dinner.
We come back to his house and we're in the kitchen, and I've got some tight dress on. I don't think I'm even like wearing underwear, ready for the sexy moment. And we start making out in the kitchen. I say to him, put me up on the countertop. And so he sits me up on the countertop. He lifts up my dress and he's going down on me. And I'm just remembering, like, just relax. Like, there's nowhere to get to. I don't traditionally orgasm from oral sex either. It just never really did a whole lot for me. But he's going down on me, and I'm just going to relax. There's nothing to do, nowhere to get to, no big deal. And all of a sudden, it feels like my hands have like moon gloves on them. Like they're like 10 million times bigger than they are. And my face starts to tingle. And I start to have this feeling that I'd had, months before when I had that big awakening.
Her premier full-body orgasm.
And all of a sudden, I don't know what it was, but I was like, I need your lips on mine right now. I need your lips. I need your lips. And he just like puts his face up. I'm like, just press your lips on mine. He just presses his lips against mine. And in that moment, I had this massive wave of energy and pleasure that just came up through the bottom of my feet, up my whole body, and literally like shot out my heart. It's just this biggest burst of love. And all these tears start running down my face. And we're just sitting there on the countertop. I can't even move. I can't move my hands. They're all like clamped. Like I can't, like the muscles are all like tensed shut. It was just this unbelievable experience I'd never experienced before. This massive full body wave heart orgasmic experience just from, I don't even know what, from him, from relaxing and just from saying yes to the moment and letting that energy move unhindered through my body.
Susan believes that there are two main ways to access orgasm.
One way is like what I call like the tension and release model, which is kind of what most of us generally know or think of as orgasm, where we're tightening, building, and then there's this big release, and then, it drops off and we come back to baseline. It's like climbing the cliff, having the big explosion, and then dropping off the other side of the cliff, which is wonderful.
Totally valid, Susan said, but not the only way to experience orgasm.
The other pathway is the relaxation and expansion model, or the relaxation and expansion approach, where we're not going for it. Part of that is not tightening the body. We're not tightening the muscles. We're not creating more tension. When we make orgasm the goal, we're automatically creating a certain amount of tension in the moment. When we decide that there's nowhere to get to anymore, there's no destination, we're going to show up right here, right now, for exactly what is right now. What happens is we open the gateway to so many more types of orgasm, but also types of orgasmic experiences where we literally become orgasmic rather than having an orgasm. Two very, very different things. So the lack of goal orientation is what really helps us sink more deeply into the possibilities of what's possible for our bodies and for that orgasmic energy to express itself in any numerous different ways through our bodies. What we're doing is we're training our awareness to be present to the physical sensation that's happening in the right now moment.
If you want to give that type a try, becoming super orgasmic without trying, being gentle with yourself seems important.
If you really take this on as a practice, what's probably going to happen at first is you're going to be like, well, nothing happened. Like I did a pleasure date and I didn't feel anything and nothing happened. It didn't work. Well, it didn't work because you're trying to get somewhere. Anytime I hear that, it's like, well, you're still approaching it from the old way. So it's very challenging to undo our mindset around this. But if we can be extremely patient with ourselves and understand that you're going to naturally habituate and default to what's familiar. But if you really want something new, it's about being gentle and saying, oh, I notice I'm going up into fantasy or I'm getting goal-oriented.
Susan empathizes with all of those feelings.
Like I said, in my journey, there wasn't a lot going on. There was a lot of numbness there. Like I didn't feel a lot. Imagine how frustrating that can be. And that's very, very, very common when we start to learn this other pathway of sensitization.
This practice is all about cultivating direct pleasure, she said, versus indirect pleasure, where you would use like fantasy or pleasure from someone else.
We're learning how to cultivate this other capacity that our bodies have for deep pleasure and orgasm through the direct nerve endings on the skin up to the brain. It's a completely different part of our nervous system and a very different part of our awareness.
If you are all about orgasms during sex, which again is totally okay, but you want to try this pathway, you might even want to try avoiding big O's altogether. Would it be worth it to maybe set a goal for yourself if you're struggling with letting go of those goal-oriented type thoughts to actually try to not experience orgasm? Like to say, my goal is to feel pleasure and to be.
Yes, exactly. I love it. And that's often what I'll say to my clients who are struggling with this, because our mind wants a goal. Right, I get that. So what you do is exactly what you just said. So the goal is to notice sensation. That's the goal, to notice what is available to me right now. What am I capable of noticing right now? That becomes the new thing for the mind to do. The mind gets to notice instead of the mind being, okay, I need to get to this outcome through this thing that I'm doing. So we give the mind the ability to just start to help us instead of work against us. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to have this practice of just noticing. What do I notice? Even if it's numbness or nothingness or I don't feel very much, it's all welcome. We have to learn how to embrace everything. And the more that we do that over time, what happens is we start to notice more, we start to feel more. And that's where more expanded types of orgasmic experiences become available to us, is literally through that capacity to notice.
Susan has experienced these benefits manyfold herself. Recently, she had quite the orgasmic experience thanks to the pleasure pathway work she's done, along with a type of pelvic floor training called Pompor,
where you're really learning how to isolate and strengthen and train different vaginal muscles in different parts of the vagina so that you can do really cool things during sex if you want.
She took up this practice, she said, because of her age.
I'm getting, older in my life stage, and I don't want postmenopausal pain during sex. Like, I am determined I'm going to do whatever I can to stay wet and juicy and alive. I want to take my erotic pleasure sort of to the next level.
So she started the program, and the juiciness that she had been striving for, it has totally panned out.
So I've had G-spot orgasms in the past where it's like you feel it and some liquid comes out and it feels really amazing. But I started having these experiences where it's not just like a little bit of liquid, it's just gushing, and the orgasm, it just keeps going and going. It like doesn't stop.
At one point, she had one of those gushing orgasms during sex with her partner. They finished up, and then it happened again.
We were getting ready to like go about our day, and I just started kissing him. And oh my God, I started to go into orgasm just from kissing him. And it was like I couldn't stop. I'm like, oh my God, I'm coming right now. Oh my God. And I had a massive squirting orgasm, like literally just from kissing him. So I just want to say that there's so much available to us out there. When we really start to like get in touch with that and get really conscious and aware down there, I mean, the sky is really the limit.
The myth that going through menopause means sexual vibrancy ends is something Susan is adamant about busting.
It absolutely does not have to. I know that for some it does. But yeah, there is that story that you dry out and you're just not as sexually available or interesting or interested. And that does not have to be true. And I am determined to be living proof of that because I plan to like have massive orgasms well into my 80s and 90s. And however long I live, that's going to be my thing.
If you're struggling in a sexual relationship or longing for something more, as she once did, Susan wanted to leave you with this.
You are 100% responsible for your own pleasure in the relationship. And I know that when we take that perspective, if I'm 100% responsible for my own pleasure, then it's really up to me to really advocate for what I desire, what I want, and what I need, and to find a way to work that relationally so that both people can really be happy and joyful. Let's find the pathway to our own pleasure that's in our body. Let's find that for ourselves, because when we do that, we're empowered.
Today, Susan primarily works with couples in long-term relationships who are struggling to get on the same page in terms of sex and intimacy. Beyond private coaching, she holds couples retreats a few times a year.
The retreats are fabulous. We don't get naked or do any sexual touching at these retreats. I just want to be really clear on that. But yeah, I love it. I love being able to take couples deep into an immersive experience over the course of several days where you really learn the skills of that direct pleasure route. We learn how to open that. We learn how to access our desires. And then we learn how to speak up for that, give voice to it, and have an experience of negotiating through mutually fulfilling, mutually satisfying experiences.
Learn more about Susan Morgan Taylor and her retreats at pathwaytopleasure.com. She also has a free resource called the Pleasure Keys Ebook to help you navigate your own sexual awakening, guiding with 3 principles. Find that at pleasurekeys.com. If you enjoyed this Girl Boner Radio episode, I would so appreciate it if you would post a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or send a link to a few of your friends. Thank you so much for listening.